So we've already really discussed this today in discussing the video about the new German defense agreement that we signed with them. And in that, there was a part where we said that, look, a lot of Europe is now very, very worried about what might happen defense-wise if Trump wins. So they are very, very worried. And it's all the idea of achieving strategic autonomy from the US, not having to be so reliant on them. Because as we have seen with the Trump stuff, well, would Trump answer the call for Article 6? Ultimately, the decision is in his court. Of course, there's other stuff that could happen, in the American system that maybe could force Trump to do it. But at the end of the day, Trump is still the commander in chief. And I think he still makes the final call. So even if Trump doesn't win, you've then got, well, what happens in the future? Do you get another Trump-like candidate that makes these exact same statements about NATO? You look now, even at the Democrats, where we've got things like the Storm Shadow, which are a joint UK-French, development, and yet we can't use them because America says no. Even though both us and France have said, yes, use the Storm Shadow, use it on long-range stuff, but we cannot get 100% sign off because America has not said yes to having, long range missiles. So that is still a massive thing that, all of Europe is now really having to consider achieving strategic autonomy from, from America, regardless of if Trump wins or doesn't. But we are going to talk about the what if. What if Trump wins? What happens to NATO? What could happen to those commitments? How might those, treaties be either stretched or maybe skirted around obligations that Trump might feel he can get away with doing? There's a lot of questions that do pop up in this, and it is very, very worth discussing them again. Especially today, because there's a really good article in The Guardian expressly diving into this. So we're going to go through this because it is worth going over. It is worth knowing about what could happen in this event. And it does go through some scenarios, maybe what could happen. So it is worth going over this. So before, of course, we do go jumping into this, please do remember to click on the like, share, and subscribe button. Down below, there are links to my Patreon page, the one-off donation link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can buy me coffee, the YouTube thank you button, and of course, as always, there's the Pony Club down below as well. So let's crack on then into this. So this comes from The Guardian. The title is, if Trump wins the election, NATO can expect more turbulence ahead. That is very, very true indeed. Expect a lot of turbulence ahead. So, politeness and convention do dictate that European leaders try and sound non-committal when asked about whether Donald Trump's presidency would hurt NATO. But despite the rhetoric about Trump-proofing, the NATO cohesion will be at risk from a hostile or isolationist Republican president who has previously threatened to leave the alliance if Europe defense spending did not increase. So as you can see there right away, it is not just Trump. It is potentially a future Republican president who would be hostile or isolationist. And we have seen the Republican Party become more isolationist because of Trump, because of the type of populism he has been espousing. And you've seen more of these people. J.D. Vance, his vice president, again, cut very much from that same Trump cloth. There are others there who, even if Donald Trump loses, you could end up with another, Trump 2.0 type candidate or someone else who still espouses those beliefs. So it's not over, essentially, in many ways. Even if Trump loses, these threats that Trump has sounded off and said, those are still now real concerns for Europe. So the truth is, it continues, is that the US is NATO and NATO is the US. The dependence on America is essentially as big as ever, says Jani Sheaf, the former NATO official who teaches now at the University of Exeter. He said, take the new NATO command center to coordinate assistance for Ukraine in Wasben in Germany. It is inside a US Army barracks and it is now relying on US logistics and software. So immediately, if Trump comes in and says no support for Ukraine, what happens to that command center? It's a valid question, and it is a very worrying one indeed. So US defense spending will hit a record $968 billion in 2024, and the proportion the US spends now in Europe, of course, is not disclosed. The budgets of at least over 30 different European allies, plus Canada, do amount to $506 billion, and at least 34% of the overall total. If this is true, then 32 out of the 32 members can expect to spend more than 2% of the GDP on defense this year. But in 2014, when the target was set, non-US defense spending in NATO was 42% lower than now, but not dramatically so. There is, of course, more than 100,000 US personnel stationed in Europe. What would Trump do with those? Trump could easily just go, well, I'm going to bring all the military personnel back home. You know, he could do that. He could close bases in Europe. You know, that is something he could absolutely do, which would completely undermine, NATO in Europe. So, of course, this is far more, of course, than the British Army. That figure increased more than by 20,000 under Joe Biden in June, and of course, in 2020, in response to Russia's attack on Ukraine. US troops have, of course, been long based in Germany, but a 3,000 strong brigade was then moved by Biden into Romania. And a forward command post is now based in Poland. And US troops do continue to defending the Baltic states, while fighter and bomber squadrons are based in the UK and have 5 naval destroyers currently in Spain. Boris Pistorius, the German defense minister, was recently asked whether NATO was ready for Trump. He said, elections will have a result whenever, he began, before acknowledging that much of Europe had been very slow to increase defense budgets, missing the warning of Russia's capture of Crimea in Ukraine in 2014, and only now reacting substantively in 2022, after Russia's full invasion. What we did was push the snooze button and then turn around, Pistorius said. Again, not a bad discussion of really what happened there. I do sort of agree. The threat was very clear and present in 2014, and we did ignore it. It's everyone ignored it. It's not on one country. It's we all ignored it, and I think that was to the detriment of a lot of us for that. Of course, in office, Trump did hint at leaving NATO in a very chaotic summit in Brussels back in 2018, in order now to force other allies to increase defense spending. During, of course, his 2024 election campaign, Trump has not quite gone as far in public, though his blustering tone has been very similar. In February, the Republican did suggest that he would encourage Russia to do whatever the hell they want to any country that was, quote, delinquent because it had failed to pay its dues. And that in itself should be very worrying. Estonia's not paying its dues. Do whatever the hell you want, Russia, because we're not going to respond to an Article 5 call. Go ahead and take that border town and see if the rest of NATO responds. Because, the US will not respond. That's incredibly worrying, because that is a potential scenario right there that could happen. But it could also be argued that Trump is simply now in campaign mode. But there are, of course, expected to be discussions before the next NATO summit about setting very high defense spending targets, most likely either at 2.5 or 3%, partly driven by Russia's overt aggression in Ukraine. Meanwhile, Trump's love of attention, tolerance, and tolerance for chaos and last minute decision making mean that it is unlikely that NATO's annual summit during a 4-year presidency will, of course, be a smooth over affairs. She has said that Jens Stoltenberg, NATO's recent Department General Secretary, was very successful at appealing to Trump's ego and vanity by persuading him that his complaints had led to other alliance members increasing defense spending. A year after the debacle in Brussels, the 2019 NATO summit was relatively uneventful, partly because Trump said he had been, quote, placated that NATO had become more flexible. And bear in mind, that was because of Russia's aggression in Ukraine. Everyone at that point really sort of woke up to the realization that we have to really look at our defense spending, really look at supply chains, where stuff is being built. What would you have if you were in a full scale war? Would you really be ready for a full scale war, to be using that constant consumption of ammunition, materials, etc., replacing stuff if it gets damaged or needs repairing? So it's made a lot of, especially European countries, very well a wake-up call in many regards to that. So the task, of course, now for Stoltenberg's replacement, the former Dutch Prime Minister Mark Rutte, said that if the Republican wins, she added, Rutte will know that, and of course appeal to him now as a solid European on defense spending, he said. On a recent trip to London, however, Rutte did take a different tact, wondering, of course, if Trump would want to risk isolation in a harsh, uncompromising world if the US would actually withdraw from NATO. And bear in mind, even if Trump, because Trump can't unilaterally withdraw from NATO, it has to go through like the Senate and the Congress. And would that go through? Maybe one of the two. It might go through. But as we've said, there's a lot of stuff Trump could do to basically fundamentally undermine NATO, especially in Europe, which is still very much vital, as you saw earlier from that example, vital not only to the defense of Ukraine, but to Europe as well. So there are two very big, significant differences now compared to, of course, Trump's first term. Most obviously is the effect of the Ukraine war on the eastern flank, where Finland and Sweden have now joined and frontline countries have now sharply lifted defense spending, most notably in Poland, whose budget has risen above 4% of GDP. Among the weapons that Warsaw is now in the process of buying are over 1,000 K2 tanks from South Korea and more than 350 M1A1 Abrams tanks from the US. Promsly Briska from the Polish Institute of Foreign Affairs said that increased defense spending is not a controversial issue in Polish politics. The general approach is that there is homework now to be done and that we have to do it. At this very same time, there are fears that Trump may force Ukraine into a humiliating peace by cutting off military aid to Kiev, and they are very worrying now for Eastern Alliance members, leaving them with very little choice but to carry on spending and hoping that Russia does not seek to cause havoc elsewhere. And that is the big worry. That is the big worry, constant. We have said this time after time after time after time. What would Trump do? And it does look like he would force Ukraine into some peace. Humiliating, I think, absolutely. Because, again, Trump has said it multiple times, I could end this war in 24 hours. Okay, how are you going to end that war? What are you going to do? And remember, Russian terms that Ukraine might have to sign up to would pretty much leave it absolutely defenseless for a future Russian invasion, and probably leave it tied to Russia in many of other ways. It would lose a lot of its territory. The peace deal that Putin keeps on floating is basically Ukraine would pretty much become a puppet state. And ultimately, I think Putin would go even further by maybe even demanding maybe some sort of occupation. for the express process of going into somewhere like Moldova just to try and solve the Transnistria issue once and for all. That is quite likely on that front. And as other people have said in my chat before, if that happened, would Romania maybe get involved in some way, shape, or form? You know, what could happen there? Um, so all these potential flashpoints that Trump is just, oh yeah, Putin, do whatever the hell you want. We've seen what Putin will do when he gets that free hand, and having a free hand of where he knows that there's a US president who will pretty much just let him do whatever the hell he wants. That's going to be very bad indeed for a whole host of countries, especially on NATO's east flank. So Bisk now it also is cautioning that there is now an obvious regional divergence at least emerging, where the eastern frontline nations spending well over 2% of GDP. Others, at least further west, notably Italy, Canada, Belgium, and Spain, spend less than 1.5. Though the advantage for a country like Poland is that it is now gaining and growing relative power within the alliance framework. The second difference is that there is now more sophisticated thinking in the US conservative circles, which, drawing on Trump's instinctive complaints about European defense spending, gives retreating from NATO intellectual ballast. A widely circulated article back from February of 2023 by Samantha Mirfa, advocating the idea of a quote dormant NATO, essentially argues that the US needs now to pivot defensively to face the rising military power of China as a control to force a European defended by Europeans with only American naval support and as a logistics provider of last resort. What did we say about Trump withdrawing, troops from America? That does represent what we've been saying all along, how vital, America has been to European defense. The whole idea that if Europe is attacked, America will be there to defend. This is why, once again, all of Europe needs to come together to defend itself. And bear in mind, what does then this mean for American foreign policy? If America does want to go to war with China, like over Taiwan, then we should be asking the question of America, well, if you're not really going to be concerned about our security concerns, why then should we care about yours? And I think that is the question that will sort of have to be asked. And once again, I've said it, but the UK, under these, if something like this happens, the UK is going to become very, very buddy with the rest of Europe. Very, very buddy indeed with the rest of Europe. So this would, it continues, imply a very significant US troop withdrawals, though the opportunity for Russian aggression is limited by the fact that the Kremlin now is heavily employed in Ukraine. Even if that war were to halt at least on favorable terms to Moscow, if Trump could actually force a peace on Ukraine, the estimated 600,000 casualties that Russia has suffered and the destruction of military material would probably mean they would perhaps take a decade or more to recover from a further its further offensive potential. Here's the thing: if you know America's not going to get involved, do you wait a year? Do you wait this decade? When you have a large army, you're going to use it. I've said this multiple times before. After Ukraine, Putin is going to have a very large army. Where does he go next? Because he is going to use it in some way, shape, or form. That is a guarantee. It's just, where will he go next? If he doesn't use it and he demobilizes, great. But for how long? How long does that, military rearmament matter? ultimately he's really going to be relying at that point on China to really re-engage his military stuff. And I think for as long as Russia keeps any Ukrainian territory, we should keep these sanctions on him. Like, we should basically be making this very clear. If you take territory that is not yours, we ain't going to lift these sanctions from you. And I think we should be making that very, very clear to Trump. And someone needs to say that to him. Vijar Lubi, Estonia's ambassador to the UK, also argued that it may be possible to link the importance of NATO supporting Ukraine in its war against Russia to now long-term US concerns about China, articulated by the American conservatives, saying, I wonder if seeing North Korean troops on the soil of Ukraine will change the calculus. We've already seen Iranian weapons ending up both in Ukraine and in the Middle East, he said. What if it's a proxy war in Ukraine and Russia is a proxy, a Chinese proxy, he asked. It is a neat, if chilling argument, and one that was made by Pistorius and his British counterpart, John Healey. The entry of North Korea on Russia's side of the Ukraine war has showed that there is now an invisible link with security concerns in the Indo-Pacific as well, Healey has argued. But will it be persuasive enough for Trump, whose politics now are largely indicative of personal-led and less certain? With now tough spending decisions looming and a war continuing on the edge of Europe, a Trump presidency does promise, at the very least, to be a very bumpy. Meanwhile, the alliance's post-war Cold War relevance has never been higher. And yeah, we've really got to look at that and see what happens there, because it is worrying. It is very, very worrying if Trump wins. There's a whole things, like I say, maybe he could start the process, but again, he'd have to sort of vote out of it. Does he pass that vote? Probably not likely. I think the Democrats would stop him. But then there's a ton of stuff he could do. Like I say, he could maybe withdraw all the American troops from Europe. He could close down bases. He could stop all support to Ukraine. That then obviously relies a lot on US logistics. We would then have to make sure that there are other logistical lines that are going through from the sources where all these where most of Europe is, through to Ukraine without US support. Make sure that those things are in place. There's a lot of questions that this often raises, both big and small, from basic logistic stuff. How do you move, maybe artillery ammunition that maybe lands somewhere in a Belgian port? How do you then get it to Ukraine logistically without American support? That's a small question to the big question of what do we do about defense? Because this is a thing where we as Europeans need to come together and say, hey, we need to really look and defend ourselves. And if the German deal that we did very recently is a way to do that, then I can see that potentially being a lot of the future. This whole idea of achieving more strategic autonomy from America, not necessarily going to be a bad thing, especially when you look recently at what happened with the Storm Shadow stuff. The fact that, again, it's a UK, French development, but we can't authorize it because America still says no. Frustrating as it is, but there you go. So yeah, obviously, I think the world is still, and I think a lot of people in Ukraine are really collectively holding their breaths, very, very much so, over the next sort of couple of weeks, because we are now really counting down to that election. And that is going to very much dominate pretty much what we probably talk about for the foreseeable future. And then, of course, fingers crossed and everything. So we'll see. So, as always, let me know what you think down below. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.